And welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on the Battery Insiders podcast, live here from the US, from Las Vegas, at the Lithium Ion Battery Americas 2024, which is hosted by SMM Shanghai Metals Market. I'm very delighted to have Kevin Fogg with us, who is the Director of Compliance at LG Energy Solution Vertech. So we're excited to have you.
Great to be here today.
Thank you. And my name is Simon Engelke, founder and chair of Battery Associates, and I'm really excited for this conversation. And to kick it off, because I think we're going to talk a bit about ESS, we're going to talk about, codes, standards, perspectives, and impacts. And maybe for the first question, can you provide a bit of an overview of what ESS codes and standards are and why they're important in the context of energy storage systems?
Sure. Yeah, to start, the ESS, it's constructed of different components, starting with the cell, going to battery modules, going to racks, then enclosures. And, for the cell and the module, the main standard for that is UL 1973. And then the system then gets rolled into UL 9540. And then, so that kind of covers the product level standards. And then you also have the overall installation system standard, which is NFPA 855. And that's really the key standard that is used by ESS, for governing installations.
That's here for the US market, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
And that would be maybe next kind of question, like how do they differ, right? The ESS codes and standards across regions or jurisdictions?
Yes.
And what are some of commonalities among them you have seen?
Sure. Yeah, with the jurisdictions, usually they'll all be using something similar like the International Fire Code. So that actually is a model code that forms the basis for a lot of the local fire codes. So model code is something that a standards development organization, will develop and maintain. And then each individual government will then adopt, that model code and, put it into law, and then amend it accordingly, based on local requirements. So while, there's a common starting point with the model code, like let's say the International Fire Code, would be the basis. And then each, city or county might, adopt a version of that. But where you may get some differences are with the local amendments, because some areas will amend, that code to meet its local needs. And you also have timing aspects where some counties and cities will be on different versions of the fire code. So you'll have the International Fire Code with 2018, 2021, and 2024 editions, but cities and counties may be on different versions. And that's one of the challenges that the industry faces is, trying to work with all of the stakeholders to, be on, I guess, a kind of a common, set of requirements, but sometimes it's difficult because the requirements are not always standardized.
Totally. Yeah, I think that can be quite challenging from a legal perspective as well.
Yes.
And maybe then also, how do these standards and codes influence the design and installation and operation of energy storage projects?
Sure. Yeah. Like with NFPA 855, as an example, like there are requirements that, for fire protection, explosion mitigation, as well as for, the enclosure spacing. And, these all actually play a role, in the system design because, the manufacturer and the system designers have to make sure that, the designs are compliant, with the requirements, and they're also, within, these standards, there are always also reference standard as well. So there will be, almost like a set of standards that also need to be met in addition to NFPA 855. So things like the fire, alarm design, the way the communications are set up, all of those things are kind of governed by, by these codes and standards.
So it really has quite a lot of implications there, right?
It does. And now, it is, it's one of those things where if, the system designers understand the requirements in advance, then it's straightforward. If you know the requirements, then the system can be designed accordingly. And that's actually really the preference. I think actually system designers and engineers, they would prefer to know what the requirements are so that, then the system and, the software and the whole, the entire package can be designed accordingly. But one of the challenges is that often the technology development is much faster, than the codes and standards development. So then there's always a little bit of lag when it comes to, codes and standards.
This would be, I would now think about the US market alone. So in the US, you already have these differences and you might have to do tailoring and designing for it.
Yes.
But of course, then even if you go internationally, right, I guess it gets even more complex.
It does. Yeah. But I do think that in general, I think once the, stakeholders understand, what the requirements are and why, requirements are set up that way, then I think, provides a basis for some commonality in terms of system design and, trying to meet the same requirements. But I think a lot of times the situation you run into is that there's some education that's needed and, communication among stakeholders, so I think, once those are, set up and perform, then it can help pave the way, for more straightforward approach, to system design, to getting all of the approvals. But because there are some differences right now and some, gaps in education, then, there's a little bit of catch up that occurs.
And yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen the same also through the Battery MBA, where we see a lot of different stakeholders come together.
Yes.
And as you say, like I think that's been a big learning from each other to see,
Correct.
okay, what are, how people operating in this legal framework.
Yes.
And as you say, right, like different regions have maybe more advanced requirements. But often, as you say, these things kind of tend to balance us out.
Correct.
Because then you see, okay, over there, they're doing this seems to work well. We should maybe implement something like this. So over time, it gets more homogenized, but like over time, right, it takes the time to get that.
Yeah. And we have seen a lot more involvement, from different stakeholders, especially in some of the code and standards committees, where, like in one case, there's one committee that has, like 120 or 130 people, mainly because, you have a lot of different stakeholders, different vantage points, and you've got different sets of input, so that's been really valuable because, there's a lot of dialogue that occurs, among these, technical committee members that otherwise wouldn't happen, so I think having, that kind of collaboration and that kind of, that sort of communication just really helps quite a bit.
That makes sense. And then I guess one question also looking a bit more at emerging technologies, right? It's a very dynamic field. I think
it is.
Also today we had questions even on the panel moderated about what should we do about sulfur batteries and different things. And people are like, I'm a recycler, and suddenly people tell me about like, there's a new chemistry maybe coming, and what does it mean for me, right? And I think similar to you, what does it mean now if we have this emerging chemistries which are coming on the market and maybe some of the trends you're seeing there?
Sure. Yeah, I think from the, how those emerging technologies are handled with codes and standards, there are different task groups often, that will be set up on these committees. And usually there will be one that will handle emerging technologies. And there have been, we have had cases where, some of the emerging technology companies actually, would be invited to provide a presentation, about their technology, what some of the hazards might be, and, what some mitigation approaches are. And then, that kind of input then can get factored in, to the codes and standards, based on that. So I think, one really positive thing is that the committees do see and do recognize that, there are emerging technologies, and, definitely welcome, the input, from the different stakeholders for these technologies.
Interesting. And I think one comment also today was interesting, I think on a panel was about how essentially in China, all the ESS is LFP, which is also regulatory driven as well.
Sure.
Which was kind of, it's safer and things, so you should use that. And I'm wondering now if you look at, let's say US market and you have a system, let's say with LFP or with an NMC system or a mix. So does it like make differences, I guess, from a standards and, what kind of standards and codes you have to apply to it?
The same codes and standards would apply, so it's one of those cases where some of the documents like, let's say the hazard mitigation analysis document that's prepared, that would capture, the product or the system that's being installed, regardless of the chemistry. So I think that's something that's kind of built into the code that way, that the kind of safety documents for emergency response, hazard mitigation, already cover different technologies.
That would also cover like new ones like sodium ion and others, or is there? So it will be.
Yeah, because the submitter would have to prepare the documents, based on the technology, so, in that sense, that it would be covered.
Which is good. So there's some flexibility there.
Correct.
And it doesn't have to be revised all the time.
Right.
And I guess also kind of would be interesting of your perspective also how codes and standards impact the cost effectiveness and over viability of energy storage projects.
Sure. In the longer term, having codes and standards applied, it's really beneficial because, they help provide safety, to the community, having things that are built, to, withstand, let's say disasters and, being able to withstand the normal, rigors of operation in a safe way. It's really important. So I think in the longer run, the codes and standards do make, the projects more economically viable and sustainable. But in the shorter term, if there are new requirements that were unforeseen and suddenly have to get designed in, then it can be difficult because, there will be added costs, added complexity that were not originally envisioned, but if the requirements are known in advance, then, those kind of features, could be built in and then, to be able to meet, the requirements.
Great. And then maybe also one of the final question would be, in your opinion, what will be the most important considerations for policymakers, developers, and other stakeholders regarding ESS codes and standards moving forward?
I think the most important thing is to really collaborate and communicate because, it's a case where, these ESS systems have long gone past just being like a battery system, just, for battery manufacturers to be involved with, really you have not only the battery manufacturers, but, the system integrators, the site owners, the local authorities having jurisdiction. You also have, insurance companies as well, and you have investors, and this, the general community as well. So I think, a really important thing is really for everyone to be communicating and to really understand, the different perspectives, because, by doing that, then you can really move forward in additional deployments, and making sure that, the systems can be built and operated in a safe way.
There may be like a final question on this one will be maybe some of your takeaways or learnings, right, for being in this industry, also on compliance side and interacting with all these different stakeholders. Is there any things you took away, maybe also some surprises or any takeaways maybe you would just to share with some others?
I think one key takeaway from being involved with codes and standards is just how many stakeholders there are. I think that's the one thing that I really gain a better appreciation for. When you're involved, you may be looking at one aspect, but then you're going to have several people that will discuss points that weren't considered before by me, and then you get a better understanding of what some of the concerns and what some of the issues are, so that you can then help address them and really move the industry forward.
Great. Well, as someone who also has been involved in some of these processes, I can very much agree to that.
Sure.
It's a fascinating world, yeah. And it requires people who are passionate about these topics to make sure that, the different voices are communicated and all brought together and incorporated. Great. No, really, really appreciate Kevin.
Oh, sure.
For coming on
Thanks
today.
for this opportunity. I'm really glad to be here today.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening to the Battery Insiders podcast. Hopefully tune in soon again. And